In 1873, a young amateur engineer, fresh off the boat from Ireland, slipped and fell on a busy Boston street. At first glance, it was an unfortunate start to his new life in the United States. However, as he recovered, he began to work on an invention that would change man's relationship with the sea forever.
In 1880, the idea of building a craft that could go underwater for extended periods of time must have seemed crazy.
He had a dream, he had a vision, and as each success got bigger and better, so did his dreams.
John Holland has a place front and center in the history of submarines. He started it all.
Like his invention, Holland's story has been hidden from view. It is time to dive deep into the depths of history and discover the truth of his remarkable story.
John Holland's idea and his design established the United States Navy submarine force.
A story of Irish revolutionaries, British spies, and war profiteers. But above all, a story of the forgotten genius, John Philip Holland, who spent years of his life in pursuit of the impossible dream. It was here, in the busy waters of New York Harbor, that John Philip Holland tested his first submarines. But this story begins across the Atlantic on the west coast of Ireland, where Holland was born in 1841.
John P. Holland's father came to Liscannor first because he was a member of the Coast Guard. John Holland would have been out with his father, and it was part of his brief to go across Liscannor Bay to the other Coast Guard station, which was on the opposite side of the bay. It's full of folklore and full of stories. And there was also this wonderful story about the hidden village at the mouth of the bay. It was called Kilshtefin. It is believed that this hidden village is still at the mouth of the bay. And I could imagine young Holland being really taken by this as his dad told him the story when they crossed the bay. I think since he was a young boy, he was always very inquisitive, and it probably put it into his head that, wow, maybe there is a world under the water, and this idea of Atlantis.
In 1873, Holland arrived in the US. He was 32 years of age, and until that point, he had lived a difficult life. He had grown up during the Irish potato famine, when his brother and a close relative had died. While still a young boy, Holland lost his father, and he dreamed one day of following in his father's footsteps and earning his living upon the sea.
He was lucky enough to have studied navigation in the CBS in Ennistimon. As a consequence, he went forward to do the navigation exam. But after passing the exam, the written work, he failed the medical due to his poor eyesight. But even though he was short-sighted, I really think that in his brain, in his mind and in his intellect, he was so far-sighted.
Holland joined a religious teaching order. He was a well-loved teacher, though he did not get on well with his superiors. It was here as a teacher in Cork City where his interest in science and engineering was first awakened.
The beginnings of the submarine, in his mind, dates back to when he was in the labs of the Christian Brothers. He drew drawings, he came up with ideas, he did a little bit of research, and he spent some time documenting what are those challenges, what are the problems that have to be solved to make a boat that goes underwater.
When John Holland came in here to begin his formation, luckily enough, there was a man there, the great Dominic Burke, a great inventor, a great scientist. He had that kind of a mind. Give them basic skills in the making of tools, dealing with steel and metals of different types. And he had a very willing disciple in John Philip Holland looking at him, doing all of this. Dominic Burke's family, they had a great background in wood carving and so on. And Dominic had carved out the model of a submarine, made it out of wood for John Philip Holland.
With no way of seeing his designs realized, they remained locked in his head for several years. He left the religious teaching order and set out to join his brother in the United States of America.
One day in winter, I slipped and broke my leg. I was laid up for 3 months and needed something to pass the time away. I began to think of my submarine boat. A short time thereafter, following out the ideas thus inspired, I thought it ought to be possible that a boat could be made that would go underwater.
Certain problems were more complex, certain problems were simpler than he realized. His original designs were pedal-powered. He had the man in a diver's suit with an extensive apparatus to refresh the air and keep it clean. So all that stuff went.
With the fire of his curiosity rekindled, Holland knew that to succeed, he would need access to the latest in technology. In a twist of good fortune, he was offered a teaching job in Paterson, New Jersey.
Holland came to Paterson in 1874. Paterson was a city of immigrants. You had the Irish, you had the Italians, you had Polish, you had German. Men, women, children working in a textile industry. You had the locomotive industry. You had 5 locomotive producers. You had the machine shops churning out machinery for the United States and the world. It was an industrial mecca. So for a person that was interested in technology, this was the place to be. And Holland got in on the ground floor.
I don't think it's a coincidence that Holland has to come to the United States to see his vision fulfilled. I think he certainly breathes in that can-do spirit of America and meets other Irish Americans who also see America as an opportunity, not just for economic advancement, although there is that, not just for innovation, although there is that too, but also an opportunity to strike back.
The Fenians were a group of Irish revolutionaries who used the United States as a safe haven from which they could attack Britain.
Holland's involvement with the Fenians occurs at a critical time in the Irish American nationalist movement. You have these huge personalities, John Devoy and Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. So there's a fund being advertised in the Irish press called the Skirmishing Fund. It's the invention of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, and every week he's announcing that he's going to bring death and destruction to London, so please send your pennies and your dollars, and people do.
His brother Michael, his younger brother Michael, was thought to be a member of the Fenians. And he had gotten an invitation to talk to the leaders of the Fenians.
What's impressive to me about Holland is that he was able to persuade this hard-headed, pragmatic revolutionary, John Devoy, that this scheme from science fiction could work.
then came $4,000 from the skirmishing funds for the submarine. $4,000 was a lot of money considering that all their donations were nickels, dimes, and quarters back then.
I think it's pretty clear that John Devoy had plans to use a submarine as a weapon of destruction against British shipping outside of the United States. So some of these tens of thousands of dollars that O'Donovan and Rossa had helped to begin to raise, that money is not in fact going to send bombers over to London. It's in fact going to John Holland, who has an idea to build a submarine.
Holland knew that for most people, underwater travel was a complete fantasy. He knew that until then, every single attempt to build a submarine had ended in disaster.
People did die in early submarines. One of the classics is talking about the Hunley, where several crews died in the Hunley. Each time that cylinder was so stuffy, they wanted to operate with the hatches open so they could get some fresh air in. Well, if you're going to travel and the hatch is open and the top of your hatch is only a foot or so above the water, it doesn't take much of a wave, and you take water into the submarine and then you don't come back up again.
Testing the submarine would be a matter of life and death, and Holland was determined that he alone would face the consequences.
We're standing on the banks of the Passaic River in the same location that John Holland tested his first submarine in 1878. Now, no one has ever done this before, and it's supposed to be this top secret hush-hush affair. It's nothing but. There are kids and adults coming to see this spectacle. This was something that no one had seen, and they really thought that Holland was kind of off his rocker. So now his submarine was lowered into the Passaic. He had worked out his mathematical equations and accounted for the saltiness or non-saltiness of the river. And he gets the boat into the water, and the boat immediately sinks. Now we have a problem. Fenians are a little upset. The crowd is like, figures, here we go. So they all start walking away. Holland stays. He's persistent. He says, yeah, let's get it out of the water. And he would suffer a lot of failures, but he always found ways of overcoming these failures. The Fenians had a very disappointing response because they had poured all this money, all these nickels and dimes, and I could just see O'Donovan Rossa like wagging his finger at Devoy saying, I told you so, but they didn't give up. And Devoy knew Holland's grit and his determination. He took it out of the Passaic River, raised it, dried it out, figured out that there were a couple of badly riveted rivets, and tried it again. It's 14 feet long, probably 2 tons. He brings it back, and on June 6, 1878, he comes down again to the Passaic River. He gets it into the water. There's positive buoyancy. He's floating. There's no problems. He closes the hatch. He tries to start the engine, and it fails. And again, he's not deterred. He hooks up a steam engine on shore. He submerges. There's bubbles. Now you can't see the submarine at all. And he's gone 5 minutes down south on the river here. No one sees him. Everybody assumes he's goner. The submarine is now being talked about as Holland's coffin. And everybody's thinking, all right, the guy's done for. Crazy professor is over.
When we look at the Holland 1, it is a very small boat. He cannot see what he's doing inside. He cannot move around. And if he doesn't come up quickly, people on the shore began to panic. They figured he was a goner.
You know, it was way below the surface of the water. And no one had seen a spectacle like this. "400 yards later, craft comes up from out of the water, the hatch pops, Holland emerges, and the crowd goes wild. The crowd went wild. The Fenians were ecstatic. You know, Holland proved his principles of submarining would work.
To actually do what he did, you can claim that he was courageous. To me, it is more of conviction. He had studied it at length. He had done pages after pages of calculations because he was absolutely certain it was going to work. He was certain he was going to come back up again.
Holland had turned the fantasy of underwater travel into a new reality. It was a huge achievement. But while he didn't know it at the time, even greater challenges lay before him. With the Holland 1, John Philip Holland proved his worth as a talented inventor and engineer. The submarine survives to this day in the Paterson Museum, New Jersey.
This was the first of a series of 6 submarines designed and built by John Holland. It's very basic. It's about 16 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet tall. Inside we had the engine, we had the pilot, John Holland, and a number of gauges and pumps. You could just barely get a man in there with the engine that's sitting inside this. The engine is part of the center compartment through here, takes up most of the center compartment. The man would have to lie down, reclined here with his feet going forward in order to balance the weight of the engine in the aft end. Like most submarines, the good stuff is inside. About all we can see on the outside are these, which we call today dive planes. They called them horizontal rudders back then because they hadn't invented the term. To submerge, tanks that were located in the forward end and the aft end had to be pumped out. You had a hand pump for that purpose. And there would be a small amount of reserve buoyancy left over, and he would then drive the submarine under with the planes. Should anything happen and he'd lose motive power, the submarine would float back to the surface. At least that was the idea.
Holland may have built a vessel capable of underwater travel. But that was not enough for the Fenians. They needed more. They needed a weapon of war.
His whole method of attack was that you would park the submarine on the bottom, flood the center compartment, get out, walk over to the ship, and plant a bomb on the bottom of it. He would then go back to the submarine, pump out the center compartment, and make his escape. Well, the first thing that happened is he went out in a submarine, he went underwater and realized he couldn't see a darn thing. How was he ever going to find the ship? Obviously, that plan wouldn't work.
Holland learned from his mistakes on the Holland 1, and he ruthlessly set about redesigning his next vessel. Everything was changed.
It must be perfectly watertight and strong enough to resist the collapsing pressure. Sufficient air must be provided to afford an unstinted supply. Past experience has shown that at least 8% of the volume of the boat must be ourselves. Buoyancy must be reduced before the boat can sink. Must be done either by emitting water equal in volume to the emerged body of the vessel.
He was determined that this vessel, the Holland 2, would be the benchmark for every future submarine.
The single most important thing was he seemed to be the first one to recognize the importance of a fixed center of gravity. The water sloshing around in tanks had doomed numerous submarines before his, but he realized that couldn't be allowed to move, so his tanks were kept completely full or completely empty so the center of gravity didn't move. And this is what allowed him to dive by tipping the submarine up or down. So that is the key one, because it allowed the porpoise, what they called porpoising, to dive.
John Holland, apart from being influenced by the birds going down underwater and coming up again, he would have seen the porpoises, and he would have been influenced, I think, but how they could, just rise and go down so easily, and how streamlined the whole operation was. And I think that would have influenced him terribly when he went to design the actual shape of the submarine. And we actually know from his writings in later life that the actual shape of the porpoise was a huge influence on how he was going to shape his submarines.
This is the famous Fenian Ram. It was funded by the Fenians, but it was never intended to ram a ship. It's got a number of features. One is it's round. The very first one, it was cheaper to make a square box, I think, than a round box. One of the reasons that it got to be this size was that he now put a standoff weapon, a compressed air gun. The gun, breech of the gun is located right about here, with a barrel that goes all the way to the forward end of the submarine. The other big innovation here is on the other end of the boat. The dive planes that we saw in the center of the Holland 1 have now moved all the way to the stern. A small angle on these dive planes would tip the entire boat down, and then with the propeller sitting here as it is, the propeller would efficiently drive the submarine underwater. Then, of course, reversing the planes would take the bow up, and up she would come. This worked beautifully. Called it porpoise diving. The fact that he had controlled his longitudinal center of gravity and buoyancy so that he could safely porpoise dive was the major development that we see here in Holland submarines that started the whole ball rolling. Inside, you would find the engines, the air compressors, pilot seats, all the controls to operate, and it was room for 3 people in there, and with room to walk around. Because you now had a submarine that was powered, that could dive and surface at will, a standoff weapon to attack with. The projectile was about 6 feet long. Put the projectile in, close the breech, open up the valve, let the compressed air in, out came the projectile.
In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne gave his Nautilus the power to fire a torpedo and sink any ship at will. Holland had made this fantasy a reality. Well, almost. He now had to test this weapon on the busy New York waters.
For lots of people whose lives were tough, I don't know that there would have been any better entertainment in New York Harbor than the test of the Fenian Ram. I mean, they could go out and see this thing out of science fiction, submerging and coming back up. There's a story about a ferry boat captain who was in the harbor and the Fenian Ram pops up and he's so frightened that he basically turns the ferry boat around and returns to shore. As you can imagine how frightening this sight must have been.
The Fenian Ram is fitted with a pneumatic gun that would fire a 6-foot-long projectile. The problem was, the first time they fired it, it buried itself in the mud, and they never found it. The second time, they hit a piling on a dock and scared the living daylights out of a fisherman that was on the other side.
The Fenian Ram sounds like a very romantic title for a ship. It wasn't something John Holland came up with, it was something that a newspaper reporter came up with. But that tells you it has been financed by this secret oath-bound organization. And here's this project which they have opened up. It is as transparent as anything they've ever done. Newspapers are writing about this amazing invention.
An alleged Fenian torpedo ram. It could blow up any ship that floats.
The feeling that Holland had when he was testing it must have been nirvana. I mean, to take this vessel that he created, designed, and helped build, and know that it could navigate and do the things that he always said it could, must have been exalting.
One of the things that I think Devoy probably was very proud of is that he was showing off Irish ingenuity. You know, he saw this not just as a weapon of war, although that was its main purpose, but he also saw this as a remarkable achievement for Ireland.
The British sat up and began to pay attention. To their horror, they learned that the Fenian Ram was not some media invention, but a very real threat. An undetectable, deadly vessel that could end their domination of the seas forever.
The British, they're watching these experiments taking place in the open. British diplomats in London write to Washington and say this torpedo ship, as they call it, is capable of fantastic power. And they don't mean that as a compliment. That is a sign of their fear. So they're very concerned. They're looking at it as a weapon of war that is meant for them. The principal spy for the British was a man known as Henry Le Caron. He was French-Canadian, and he was mostly in Chicago, in Illinois. He was a doctor, so he said. And he persuaded these very hard-headed, skeptical Clan na Gael people, Devoy included, that because he was French, that he shared their hatred of Britain. The real weak point was the money. So Devoy had converted the skirmishing fund from this treasury designed to bring war to London to fund the submarine experiments. So critics like O'Donovan Rossa begin accusing Devoy publicly of wasting money. So that's in the air. That can be exploited. So it's almost, in some ways, too easy for Le Caron to make things worse.
Le Caron was known as the Prince of Spies. His British masters gave him orders to destroy relations between Holland and his financial supporters, the Fenians.
This wild scheme had to do with the manufacture of a submarine torpedo boat, with which it was intended to inflict terrible damage on the British Navy underwater.
Holland still wanted to continue his invention and his discovery and an expansion of his ideas, because now he went from the 1 to Fenian Ram, boat number 2, to 3, and now he's like on a roll. And he's still in this process of discovery. And the Fenians are like, stop, this is it, this is perfect. We now have the weapon that we need to rid ourselves of the British Navy and get our Irish independence.
In Canada, a politician and a former Irish revolutionary named Terence D'Arcy McGee was murdered at around this time. Some years later, a doctor in Chicago was killed in a feud. So in the middle of all of this faction fighting, in the middle of all of this division, in the middle of all this violence is John Holland, who, whatever his political goals may have been, we know that he had one important goal, which was to get his vision, to get his invention funded and operating. I don't think he wanted to be caught in the middle between the Chicago wing of Clan na Gael and the New York wing, between O'Donovan Rossa and Devoy. This was not in the plan. I think as he looked at the level of violent language, he may have thought, if I make a bad decision here, my life could be in danger.
As it turned out, It wasn't only Holland's life that was in danger. His life's work was, too.
The skirmishing fund was ripe for a lawsuit, and sure enough, somebody named Dennis Mulcahy, who was a member of Clan na Gael, files a lawsuit. And there's a sense of panic that a court could seize the Fenian Ram.
A small group of the Fenians went down to the dock where the Fenian Ram and the Holland III were tied up with papers with a forged signature. They showed them to the night watchman. The night watchman granted them access to the boats. But of course, none of those had ever been in the boat before. They didn't know how to operate it. It did not come with an instruction manual. Holland knew how to operate it, but they did not.
Now, the problem that they had was the conning tower on boat number 3 was not on securely. And it was very choppy water, November water. And it filled the submarine and it snapped the tow line.
The Holland III sank off the Whitestone Bridge somewhere and has not been recovered. John Holland was furious. He went on some rather long rants about the stupidity of what they had done.
It's hard to imagine just how upset he must have been. The horror, the bitterness that he must have felt when he realized that this project that they had been working on literally for years, stolen from him.
I received no notice of the contemplated move then, nor was I notified after. I have no intention of advancing any excuses for the incident, as no official explanation was ever made to me concerning it. As a result, I never bothered again with my backers, nor they with me. I let her rot in their hands.
Saddled with debt and unpaid bills, Holland had no way to raise the money to build another submarine from scratch. His dream now lay in shreds. For Holland, the Fenian Ram had been his life's achievement. But now, with his submarine stolen, he had no way of showing the world what he had created. Many years would pass before one last chance would present itself.
His sweetheart was Margaret Foley. They get married and they're having a family, and finances really do matter to him because he's got a family to feed. He now takes a job as a draftsman for the Charles Cumming Dredging Company, and he's designing buckets. So he's got steady work now.
The United States Navy, a general description embodying the scheme of a proposed submarine boat. The most desirable qualities to possess by such a vessel while approaching a hostile ship on the way are speed, certainty of direction, invisibility, and safety from the enemy's fire.
In the time that Holland was really productive, you're talking 1870s into 1900, submarines were actually sold or marketed to the Navy as a coastal defense system or harbor defense system. Because remember, we are a trading nation, and the major cities in the United States were on the East Coast. And if you have a submarine that is unknown to attacking fleet where it might be, and that would be a great asset for the United States.
Holland knew he had the technical knowledge to win the competition. But with a family to feed and a steady job to lose, did he still have the will?
The problem that many, perhaps most inventors have is money. They've got the ideas, but to turn the ideas into working prototypes takes money. And certainly if you're going to develop something as big as a submarine, it's going to take lots of money.
He ran out of money and needed investors, and two individuals came along. One was a man named Isaac Rice, and the other one is Elihu Frost. Frost was an investor. Rice was a successful businessman. They were in business to sell things, and one of them was a Holland submarine to the U.S. Navy. In one sense, it was great because now Holland had money to finally produce and complete the boat in a proper shipyard with guys who were used to building things over periods of years. So you had a superintendent shipbuilding, you had metal workers. They were used to building iron and steel type of boats, which were a great benefit to Holland.
However, in exchange for money up front, Holland gave up ownership of all his patents to the newly formed Electric Boat Company. He had more pressing issues to deal with. For although he had won the US Navy competition, he suddenly came under huge pressure to change the fundamentals of his design.
The trouble with submarine boats is that naval officers do not want them. They have no quarterdeck to strut upon or rooms to have balls in. They are intended not for pleasure, but for business. We shall know in a few weeks whether our government buys our boat and orders more.
There were very powerful people within the Navy. Calling him a crank, somebody whose only background was a school teacher, could actually come up with something that worked when they hadn't.
The Navy forced Holland to install a steam engine because this was how they powered their other ships.
They say in America that all inventors are cranks, and I'm beginning to be convinced that they're right. If they're not crazy, I would not have been driven to inventing things and designing submarines. I would have gone and learned to dig or do some other decent work that would give me peace of mind and give me a chance once in a while of remembering where I am at.
The temperature inside was climbing to over 120 degrees. This made it impossible for the crew to work, and it was ultimately the single biggest default that doomed the plunger. Holland had foreseen that problem. He had insisted on putting insulation in around that boiler, but the Navy refused to do so because it wasn't their standard practice.
Holland could not persuade the Navy to change their mind. Nor was he prepared to sit back and just wait for their ideas to fail of their own accord. Bold action was called for.
Holland knew about halfway through the venture with the plunger that it was not going to work. And Holland decides, he goes back to his company and says that he wants money, funds to build his own boat.
It was a huge risk with no guarantees of success.
The steel plating of the frames are turbocharged, uses pressure of 35 pounds per square inch, which is sufficient to have tanks placed across her body in such having the capacity of sinking and churning tanks that are the boat has a
It took a lot of bravery. It took an incredible amount of guts because now he was asking his own company to invest all this money in this idea that he had and the plans that he had to show the Navy, hey, look, your idea is just not going to work.
There's some significant changes between the Holland 6 and anything else that Holland had designed previously. They got it built, finally convinced the Navy to come and witness trials. The Navy was unwilling to be on board. They insisted on watching from a tug on the surface. They certainly didn't want to go under the water. They might never come back up again.
John Holland had built his Holland 6, and the only way to sell a product is to take it into a show and tell. They brought the Holland in a show and tell, and they went out on a test to watch it. You know, the competition that John Holland got involved with was up against people that were entrenched in steam, ironclad ships, fully iron and steel-made ships with big guns on the top. All of a sudden, this guy is coming along named John Holland. There is no steam. There are no big guns sitting on it. In fact, there's no deck to walk upon.
To me, it was just a matter of discovery of a person who had the grit and determination and the fortitude not to take no for an answer. He was determined to make his submarine become a reality. The 6 boat was the crowning jewel, and the 6 did everything that a modern submarine could ever do, and it's an unqualified success.
Fiction has been outdone. Warfare's newest and most awful weapon. Underwater with the Holland torpedo boat and its terrible dynamite torpedoes.
John Holland's idea and his design established the United States Navy submarine force.
To this day, Holland is revered by the United States Navy. They consider him the father of the modern submarine.
This is the ship's stern plate, cast in solid piece of bronze, the only piece that exists from the boat to this day. The boat was cut up, Bronx, New York in the 1930s and sold for scrap.
One of the interesting facts is its hull shape. Up until then, every submarine that John Holland had designed had been symmetrical in the hull. The center of buoyancy was very close to the center of the ship. The Holland 6 had a major deviation from that. The center of buoyancy was about 30% forward of the center of the ship. That's the shape that was used for all the nuclear submarines, although they've gotten longer and bigger. And it is very much today a key element in the submarine. But it first appeared on the Holland 6. They sold 5 to the Japanese in 1904, 5 to Russia in 1904, and also 1 to the Netherlands. The company was on its way.
He then discovers that his submarine is sold to the British. The British inaugurate it as their boat number 1, which is kind of a little weird twist of fate there.
An invention that was adopted by Irish-American nationalists to wreak havoc on British shipping becomes a weapon in Britain's naval arsenal. I can only imagine what John Devoy must have been thinking.
Holland was given a position at the Electric Boat Company, which by now was making a handsome profit selling submarines to the navies of the world. He became increasingly worried about safety. He pressed the issue with the board of directors, but they ignored him. And after several accidents on board vessels which carried his name, Holland resigned his position in protest.
About 1907, after being forced out of the submarine business, he goes into some sort of retirement. His health is failing him. He is sick frequently. And he does die just before World War I begins, just before submarines are actually sink a ship.
The First World War ushered in the bloody age of submarines. In September 1914, a German U-boat destroyed 3 British naval ships. The following year, there was another attack off the Cork coast, just 30 miles from the spot where Holland had first conceived of his submarine many years before.
John Holland would have probably been appalled at the sinking of the Lusitania by submarine, by torpedo. It was a great loss of life.
Based on what I've read, I think he had been abhorred by that. You might say it was a good thing he'd passed already and didn't see it. That's certainly not what he had hoped for when he started on his journey to develop the submarine. So I don't think he would have been a very happy man to see what his invention had wrought upon the world. He certainly thought that submarines were going to end naval warfare. He fell into the same trap that so many others had done, that he had developed a weapon that was so scary, that could not be countered, that no one in their right mind would ever start a battle. So he did see it as a big leveler between the big guy and the little guy, the Davy and Goliath.
When you think about the train of events here, we have this visionary Irish immigrant, John Holland, who has an idea to build a submarine. It's financed by the Irish-American nationalist movement, and it works. It's the first working submarine. It's not an exaggeration to say that the modern submarine that we know today is an outgrowth of the Irish-American nationalist movement.
Above all, it was his grit. He was determined to make his submarine become a reality. He changed the course of science and technology and warfare and history. And it was all because of this one man from Lisconnor, Ireland.